You've helped to save these people's lives, but who knows if they'll be worth living. This is Michael Burke for the 9 o'clock news in northern Ethiopia.
Oxfam participated in an international study of the TV coverage of the famine. I asked Kathy Nash, who is now Kathy Midwinter, about the report's findings.
I think perhaps the most important conclusion was that Africans themselves are very underrepresented within the coverage of whatever it is that's happening in their own country. And in the particular instance of the Ethiopian famine in '84, there were very few Ethiopians themselves who actually had a voice, who actually appeared on television to say what was happening in their country and why.
One of the most graphic things for me about the Ethiopian emergency was the fact that the Ethiopians' own efforts were, in effect, belittled by television. Let me just give you the example of Oxfam. There were 108 workers on the Oxfam team, of whom 100 were Ethiopians and only 8 expatriates, mainly British. The impression you would have got from the television was that, in fact, it was us from the outside rescuing Ethiopia. The reality on the ground, and this was not just true of Ethiopia, but also of the Eritreans and the Tigrayans, was that they were running their own show. And the outside aid, yes, it was indispensable, but frankly would not have got to the people that were in desperate need without the energies and initiatives of the Ethiopians. And I think that whole focus on Bob Geldof, on the angels of mercy who come to rescue third world people, is extremely damaging. And any aid person on the ground will tell you it just doesn't square with reality.
I think that in the long term, the image was damaging to Africa because it tended to portray Africans as international beggars, waiting, begging ball in hand for outsiders to come and rescue them. There were many examples of African solidarity efforts which did not make their way to the media the way efforts like Band-Aid and Live Aid did. Don't misunderstand me. I think that Band-Aid and Live Aid did a lot to publicize the issue of the famine, but I think that it would have done more justice to Africans if it showed that, in fact, what was being brought in from outside was supplementing indigenous African efforts. That's very, very important to comprehend.
It's an unjust image of the Africans themselves, but it also has repercussions in this country. Black people living here see very negative images of black people overseas, and it obviously has an impact on their own self-image. White children see negative images of black people overseas, and it reinforces the stereotypes that already exist. And there's been research, for instance, in the kind of images that exist in textbooks, and these can be actually quite stereotyped, even racist sort of images, and it doesn't help to counter those.
How would you do it differently now?
We would now allow people to speak for themselves in a way that was not the convention then. People are now more used to the idea of hearing people speaking in a foreign language with subtitles on their main news programs in a way that wasn't the case, or we didn't perceive it to be the case then.
But even in 1984, subtitling was used in documentaries like this one made by Central TV, which had more time, both in the making and on transmission, to let Ethiopians speak for themselves.
There are a lot of people here from Sokoto who've walked for 6 days to get here. Why is that?
Well, as you see, there are many people here. We can see around about 20,000 people. They are here for the past 3 days because we don't have enough supply to give them and go back home. But most of them don't want to go home because they come from faraway places, about 150, 200, and some of them from 75 kilometers far from here.
So the news reports fostered an overly negative image of Ethiopia. What else did the report find?
There was a lack of analysis. There was, usually because of time constraints and the other constraints that do exist for TV news coverage. But there was very little political analysis in particular.
My primary responsibility with the first two reports was to actually say what was going on. And this wasn't a documentary, step-by-step analysis of how these people had come to be in that situation. These were reports saying, here are 12 million people who are about to starve to death. You know, in this particular camp, these people are starving, this is where they've come from, these are their circumstances, this is how little food there is, this is how much time they've got. From memory, the first report was 6 minutes long and the second report was 8 minutes long. And within that context, there wasn't an awful lot of room for background analysis. And I think now there would be, particularly in the BBC, a desire to back up the initial report with analysis of one sort or another.
The news broadcasts get by far and away the largest audiences. I mean, a story like the Ethiopian famine will go out on BBC to about half the households in the country, and if you succeed in getting it on ITV, you're really talking about virtually everyone in this country is then alerted to something happening in a third world country. However, the news agenda is very limited. If you do an analysis of the coverage of foreign affairs by British television, it's predominantly one of conflict stories, of disasters, of bad news. There's also constraints on the amount of time. The Michael Burke piece in the event was quite exceptional. It ran to, I think, something 6 or 8 minutes. The norm, frankly, for most of the third world stories that I played a role in getting onto British television would have been something like 2 minutes, if you're lucky, 2 to 3.
I think that the documentaries that were shown to do with this particular famine went a lot further and were much more useful educationally. And I think, you know, for those people who did see them, it actually puts the news coverage in some kind of context. But of course, far fewer people actually see documentaries than see news.
News coverage clearly had its limitations, but how did documentaries differ?
Well, the news reports gave us a number of impressions. Firstly, that the famine was due simply to the drought and the war. Secondly, that the Ethiopians themselves were quite helpless. And finally, that the answer to their problems lay in Western private aid. Now, all of this created an impression that was entirely false. Documentaries, on the other hand, went further. They began to analyze the complex causes of the famine, and they began to raise up some of the real issues, such as the contradictory character and implications of Western aid.